so excited that you're here. Thank you so much for coming on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. We're going to start by giving just sort of a few-minute overview of our work and highlight one of our newest books for you, one or two of our newest books. And then we might chat a little bit because we always have questions for one another once we get talking. But we promise we'll save some time for your questions at the end too. We'll do our last maybe 15 or 20 minutes at least. Joe, do you want to start us off since you're on the end there?
Sure thing. Actually, what's interesting for me about this book, which is called Of All Tribes, American Indians in Alcatraz, it's about the 1969 takeover of Alcatraz Island and the prison on that island by a group of Native people that call themselves the Indians of all tribes. It's a story that is really significant. A lot of things that happened in American culture and politics and the legal system occurred after Alcatraz. Before Alcatraz, a number of things were happening. One was the policy of basically termination. The federal government was terminating Native reservations all around the country, and it had disastrous results. It was supposed to be, as are so many policies enacted by governments, for the good of the people it was done for, but it was actually not. It was also a period when a policy called relocation was in place, which meant luring Native people to go to big urban centers where supposedly they would get job training, free housing, and could create a new life. Again, it was disastrous. The money would run out, the training would not be there, and as a result, literally Native American ghettos were created in urban centers all across the nation, including in San Francisco. I was a volunteer teacher in West Africa from 1966 to 1969. I got back just as this was happening, so I did not take part. But many people I knew were on Alcatraz and a central part of this experience. So when I began working on this book a number of years ago, I knew a lot of things that I knew other people didn't, but the more I learned about it, the more I realized how much I did not know. Even though you can be an insider to some degree, often there's a lot outside of your experience. I have some really interesting connections to it. One is that I have written now 3 books about Jim Thorpe, the great Native American athlete, and done a documentary film about it that was on PBS. His daughter, Grace Thorpe, became a close personal friend. And Grace was one of the central people on Alcatraz. So revisiting Grace's experience on Alcatraz was really wonderful for me. Also, a number of the people who were at Alcatraz were people that I had known in other contexts. So I found myself going back and interviewing, for example, Adam Fortunate Eagle, who wrote 2 books about the Alcatraz takeover, and incorporating everything they had told me into the story, which is a story that is complex, it's fascinating, and it's illustrated really beautifully and very nicely designed. I was very happy when this book came out. And I think one of the biggest surprise for me about this book was finding out, on one hand, how much I knew and how much I thought I knew that I really didn't know. And I find it to be a story that I think is crucial for anyone who wants to understand this country and the relationship that our indigenous people have had in this country and how we came to be where we are today.
Jason, you want to go right down the line?
All right. So my name is Jason Chin. I'm an author and illustrator of nonfiction picture books, mostly about science and nature. So my newest book is The Universe in You, a microscopic journey. It's a companion to the book up here, Your Place in the Universe. Mm-hmm. In that book, the reader it's kind of a book that zooms out. And the reader is taken out outside of Earth, and it discusses the size of astronomical things, our solar system, galaxies, and the whole universe. This one zooms in and it takes the reader down inside the human body to DNA, atoms, and elementary particles all the way to the bottom. When I was doing this book, it occurred to me to maybe go, instead of from a kid's perspective out to the size of the universe, I thought, well, maybe I should start at an atom or smaller, and go from the very smallest to the very largest. But that was too much. So, 2 books.
2 steps. Good call. Yeah.
It was the right choice. Let's see. The thing that I learned, I'll say this book was initially about scale. Okay, it's about trying to communicate to kids the scale of things that are so small they can't see them, the scale of the invisible, and to reveal like this invisible miniature world. And as you go down and down the scale, what I discovered was that you learn what you're made of. And actually you learn what everything is made of, because the smaller down in scale you go, it's like, well, every living thing is made of cells. It's a little debatable, we could discuss that, but all matter is, or physical matter is made of atoms, and then if you go even smaller, everything is made of elementary particles. So there's this, I don't know, I found it, I guess, profound, can I use that word? to learn how connected we all are in the fibers of our being. So that's one of the themes in this book. But it's also a fun book about really tiny stuff.
My name's Kate Messner, and I write all different kinds of books. I write picture books on up to middle grade books, but the books I want to talk about today are the History Smasher series. So these are graphic nonfiction, which means they're nonfiction told with lots of photographs and illustrations, and a good chunk of the story is told through comics as well. And these are aimed at smashing the myths that we sometimes learn about history when we are very small. So, for example, certainly everybody in the room who's around my age, and some of you who are younger too, learned a story of when you were growing up about the first Thanksgiving. And it went something like this. Once upon a time, the Pilgrims came to America, and they weren't very good at growing food in America, so they were starving. And then these nice Indians came, and they showed the Pilgrims how to grow corn. And then the Pilgrims brought in the harvest and said, we ought to thank those nice Indians. And so they said, let's invite them over for a big Thanksgiving dinner. And so the Wampanoag people came, they had Thanksgiving dinner with the Pilgrims, and they all lived happily ever after. Not at all what happened. In so many ways. And sometimes when we're talking about research and history, we have to dig and dig and dig to get to the truth of it. You don't even have to dig that hard, right? If you just look at the Pilgrims' diaries, they don't talk about this, right? They don't say, we invited the Wampanoag people for dinner. They say, we were eating and these Wampanoag guys just showed up. So as best, what is in the diary, now pieces of the story are true, right? That was the sort of the foundation for that myth that got spun around it. The pieces that are true is, of course, the Pilgrims did come to what is now America for religious freedom. They were terrible at growing food here, and there were Wampanoag people who taught them how to grow corn. It is true that the Pilgrims brought in the harvest and were getting ready to make some food, and what is in the Pilgrims' journals and diaries is that they sent some of their guys out to shoot some ducks and geese. And as best historians can figure, what happened next is that the Wampanoag people nearby heard the gunshots, wanted to know what was going on, went to check it out, and thought, oh, they're making a big dinner. Great, we'll come. Because in Wampanoag culture, as in, Joe can attest, and as in most native cultures, sharing is a big thing, right? It's very much a value that when you are making food, you feed everyone, you feed all the people. And so they assumed that they would be invited. And so they showed up, and the Pilgrims were they're like, we're here for dinner. And the Pilgrims are like, okay, I guess. And then there wasn't enough food, so the Wampanoag men went out to shoot more deer. They brought back a whole bunch of other Wampanoag people, and you ended up with this relatively small group of Pilgrims who had survived the winter before, having dinner with a large group of Wampanoag people who they didn't mean to invite, but who brought food, and it was sort of awkward. But that's not a really good Thanksgiving story, right? And the other thing that gets left out is that this isn't a nice story to tell children either, is that later the Pilgrim people and the Wampanoag people went to war because at some point people are going to fight back when you keep taking their land and encroaching on their way of life. And at the end of many of those wars, many of the Wampanoag people were sent into slavery in the West Indies. That's not a fun story to tell children. So over the years, we have erased it, we have ignored it, and replaced it with the story of this first Thanksgiving, and now you can make your construction paper hat, right? So this series really delves into smashing some of those myths, right? The story of what we've been taught versus what actually happened, what's actually supported by historical documents, in the case of many Native nations, oral tradition. So that was the first book in the series. As soon as this book came out, educators and librarians and families started asking for a book about Columbus. They were like, when are you going to do Columbus? And my answer to that was, as soon as I find a Taino writer who would like to work with me on Columbus, because that was not a story I wanted to tell on my own. So History Smashers Christopher Columbus and the Taino People just came out in August, last month. No, month before last, it's October now. And it's co-authored with Dr. Jose Barreo, who is a Taino elder and scholar. He used to work with the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. And this book tells the actual story of Christopher Columbus, who, as you know, probably if you're at this panel, has been spun into this myth of an American hero. And so many stories about him that we learned growing up just are so blatantly false. Like, you probably remember learning he was the only one who understood the earth was round. Well, no, everybody knew the earth was round by then, right? The ancient Greeks had figured out that the earth was round. Columbus knew that it was round, like everybody else, and he also underestimated the size by a lot, which is why he thought he could go east by sailing west. The other thing that's fascinating is people are like, oh, he was such a good explorer. He was an okay explorer. I mean, he wasn't bad at exploring, but he was no better at exploring than any of the other people who were out exploring then. What Christopher Columbus was really gifted at, there was kind of one thing, it was selling himself. If social media had been around then, he would have been all over it, right? At Christopher Columbus. Because he was really good at convincing people to give him what he wanted, and he was very persuasive. So he went back to the king and queen of Spain over and over and over again, and eventually, quite frankly, wore them down. And at that point, other nations, Portugal, other countries were sending people out to explore. They were like, we might as well do this. So they sent him, and he landed in what is now the Caribbean, and almost immediately started talking about what good slaves the Taino people would make. And the king and queen of Spain had not told him to do that. They were like, no, we want to spread our religion, and we want to establish trade, and we're going to set up some colonies, but don't kidnap these people. And Columbus kept kidnapping them and sending them back. Like, here, look what I got you. And they were like, stop. Why are you doing this? We said stop. And he kept doing it. On his third voyage, things were going so poorly that the Spanish monarchs actually sent over somebody to investigate, find out what's really going on. He arrived to just a total disaster. There was an uprising. There were people hanging from gallows when the ship pulled in. And they actually took Columbus and his brother back to Spain in chains. They were doing such a crummy job running the settlement. That story doesn't get told to kids, right? And so this book kind of smashes that myth of Columbus as exceptional leader. It also delves into the cruelty that his sort of regime and then the conquistadors who followed, and the genocide of the Taino and other native people. And that's again where Dr. Barreo came in to talk about maybe the most important myth, and that is the Taino people are still here. There's have been a lot of stories about, oh, they got wiped out and they're not around. No, the Taino people are still here. They're living and thriving with many of the same indigenous farming practices that they practiced, hundreds of years ago, and have passed on to their children and grandchildren and descendants. So this was a really fun book to work on, and fun probably isn't the right word. It was an eye-opening book to work on and a fascinating book to work on, and I'm really glad it's in the world.
Jose, by the way, is a very dear friend of mine. And he has a novel called Taino,
Yes.
which is a wonderful novel telling the story.
Yeah, historical fiction. So it's, imagine dialogue and things, but based on, many, many real historical documents. It's excellent.
I'm glad those books are in the world too, Kate. My name is Loree Burns, and once upon a time I was a molecular biologist, and so I worked in a research lab, and my life was diving into the cells that Jason talked about in his book, going back and back and back into these smaller environments and the universe inside our bodies. I was really into understanding what's going on inside cells. And I loved that work, but what I began to realize the more I did it and the more I focused in, was that I was not having enough time to see the cool stuff that other scientists around me were doing. And that was a real roadblock for me. I was super interested in all the parts of this world and how it works. And I slowly began to realize that there were other ways for me to explore science. And so when I began writing books about science for kids, I sort of did the same thing. I was able to broaden a little bit and explore all sorts of different topics outside of cells. And often what I'm looking for is just a really intriguing story of science, a really intriguing story of people who got interested in something they saw in this world and wanted to figure out how it worked. And then for me, the real crux of it all is how they figured out how it worked. And so I began to look for those stories, and oftentimes I would find them delightfully far away from home. And so I got to do things like travel to this uninhabited island off the coast of Iceland called Surtsey. Not very many humans have set foot on Surtsey. It's an island that emerged from a volcanic eruption in 1965. So hundreds of humans have stepped on this place, and I'm one of them. So I got to go there with a team of scientists who are trying to study how a volcanic island turns into something that looks more like Earth that we're used to seeing. And so I spent a week with those scientists and wrote all about it in a book. And it's kind of easy to find stories in all these wonderful places. I've gotten to travel to butterfly preserves in Mexico and a butterfly farm in Costa Rica. And my family, some of whom are here in the audience, began to suggest that perhaps my interest was not really writing about science for children, but vacationing alone. That was patently false. But I did start to look for stories that were a little closer to home, and not surprisingly, there are so many stories of science right in our own backyards. And so more recently, I've been writing a lot about my backyard, literally my backyard. And so the book I read this morning is called You're Invited to a Mothball, and it is a mothball is an actual real thing. It's a party to celebrate moths. And if you're saying to yourself, why would I want to celebrate moths? It's probably because you don't realize how very many unique, exciting, boldly colored, beautiful moths are out there right where you live, right here in Burlington. But it's just we're all usually sleeping when those moths are out and about. But if you wanted to get to know them, you could have a little mothball yourself. All the instructions for how to do that are in this book. There's just so much for us to see right here in our own backyard. So I'm constantly looking for stories of this world and how it works, no matter where they are. And more recently than that, even, I've been thinking a lot about, when we tell stories of science to young people, we tend to talk about the people who do science. And I've interviewed a lot of amazing scientists and told their stories, and I love that work. But as I sort of alluded to, I've also become really interested in the how of science, how we do science, and trying to find stories that kids can easily see how it is that they might ask similar questions and do the things that are required to find the answers to those questions on their own. Not going to a book and looking it up, not asking their parents, but actually asking questions that will help them understand how something they've seen in the world, maybe even in their own backyard, works. And so that's what I've been doing more recently. I'm writing some chapter books for older readers. This one comes out in the spring. I'm very excited about it. And it is everything you would ever want to know about processioning caterpillars, so caterpillars that travel around in long single files, and the cool experiments that you might do with them if you happen to come across some in your own yard. So yeah, that's me and what I do.
Yay.
Hi, I'm Kekla Magoon, and I write lots and lots of things. I write fiction as well as nonfiction, and as you heard in my bio, my work tends to have themes of identity, community, empowerment, and social justice. And in the nonfiction context, that tends to mean writing about civil rights, both in historical and contemporary contexts. So I write for all ages. I have some picture books that are biographies. So I have picture book biographies of Thurgood Marshall, the first Black Supreme Court Justice, and then I did a companion for Ketanji Brown Jackson, our first Black female Supreme Court Justice, very exciting. And so, you know, obviously the Thurgood Marshall narrative comes out of the Civil Rights Movement, the 1960s and before. He argued a lot of civil rights cases before the Supreme Court, before becoming a Supreme Court Justice himself. And also a couple of books for this She Persisted series, including a biography of Ruby Bridges, who was a 6-year-old girl who was one of the first Black children to integrate a previously all-white school in the 1960s. It was 1960 and she was in first grade, and she went all by herself into that classroom every day amidst a crowd of people who were jeering at her and threatening her and frightening her. And she was one of the youngest, but not the only child who made a really big and powerful, important stand in that huge moment in history. And so for me, you know, one of the reasons I talk about that, the sense of identity and the sense of empowerment together with civil rights, is that we don't often talk about how many young people, how many elementary school kids, middle school kids, high school kids, college students were the engine for the civil rights movement. We think it's people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks, right, who are these grown-ups. Dr. King in his day was not actually even considered a grown-up. He was this young upstart 20s and 30s minister who was really radical, right? And he was not held up in this way. He was this young guy who was trying to make a difference. And so one of the things that's really important to me is connecting young people who are in the world today trying to figure out who they are and how they can be part of the change that we still need, how to connect them with the knowledge that it was young people in the past who made that difference. And so the kind of my biggest, both physically and sort of emotionally and impact-wise, my biggest book is Revolution in Our Time, The Black Panther Party's Promise to the People, which is a nonfiction history of the Black Panther Party. And I find that just saying the phrase, a nonfiction history of the Black Panther Party, gets some people kind of, what is going on? Who would write about that? And the reason is that, you know, people in their 60s, 70s, 80s might remember the Black Panther Party, right? They might have a kind of a sense of who they were. That sense might not be accurate. People in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, say, sometimes also have a sense of the Black Panther Party, but it's just this one snapshot image, black men with guns. And often the connotation that comes with that is that it's bad, scary. So bad and scary we don't even talk about it. It wasn't in my history books, right? Kids younger than that, people in their 20s, teens, elementary school, middle school today, often have never even heard of the Black Panther Party, have no sense at all. But this was an organization of young Black people that emerged from the civil rights era in a moment in time when people were pretty convinced that nonviolent protest was not working in the way that they had hoped that it would. And the idea of nonviolent protest was we're going to show up, we're going to show the world that racism is bad by never fighting back. We know there's bias that exists in our world around us. And so when we show up and march and demonstrate and protest and we get attacked by the police and we fight back, somehow the pictures that get taken make it look like it was our fault. Right? So the only way that we can show what's bad and wrong and terrible about racism is if we commit to showing up, and no matter what, they can beat us, they can jail us, they can kill us, we are not going to fight back ever. That was the commitment that people made when they showed up to protest nonviolently. And so when we talk about this quote-unquote nonviolent civil rights movement, we're talking about an intention that the protesters had when they showed up to march. But the fact is, the civil rights movement was steeped in violence. There was a huge backlash of protests, a huge backlash against the protests by white supremacists, by police officers, by people in power who did not want to see segregation overturned, who did not want to see equality. And so there was a lot of violence that occurred in the civil rights movement. And so kids were showing up for 10 years or more to protests and marching and committing to nonviolence and still getting beaten, still getting attacked, still getting beat down. And how long could they put up with that? Turns out about a decade. And so in the late 1960s, there started being uprisings all around the country of young black people witnessing an incident of police brutality or some other kind of violence and just lashing out, exploding. There were riots and uprisings in New York, New Jersey, in Harlem, New York, in Detroit, in a very famous uprising in Watts, California, outside of Los Angeles. And there were two young men in Oakland, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who said, all right, if we don't get a handle on this, if somebody doesn't give all of these young black people a place to put that anger and frustration and fear and desire to make a difference and give them an opportunity to channel into something positive, we're just going to see our communities continue to burn. And so they formed this organization called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and they committed to patrolling their community to protect the citizens from white supremacy, from police violence. They said, the police are supposed to be patrolling the community while armed to protect the citizens. That's what their stated purpose is. But they're not actually doing that. They're actually causing more violence than they're preventing. So what if there really was a group of people who went out in the community and patrolled to protect people? What would that look like? And it looked like policing the police. So they got legal weapons in the state of California, drove around Oakland following police officers, just watching them do what they do. If somebody needed to be arrested, they could be arrested, but they would have their California state law book right there with them. And if the police officer was stepping outside of the law, they could say, look here, on page 212, it says that you can't do that in this situation. You have to let that person go. But if the person was breaking the law or needed to be arrested, they would just let it happen, watch it, and they would follow that person down to the station and help them get bail, help them make sure they understood their rights. The idea here was just to protect people, not to stop law enforcement from doing what it's supposed to do, but to keep it doing what it's supposed to do. And so that image of black men with guns following police officers was very, very scary to a lot of people. But they had a bigger vision. They had a vision for changing and transforming black communities by doing the work themselves. They said, we're marching and protesting and hoping that these powers that be are gonna change the law for us. What if we just do it? What if we just feed people? What if we just clothe people? What if we just form a school that actually teaches the history we need? And so it was young people that did that work. The majority of Panthers were 19 and younger who did this work. And so they had breakfast programs feeding kids all around the country. They had health clinics. They had schools. They were a political party advocating for people to run for office to actually change the system from within. And all of that work was in service of the same goals as the civil rights movement. And all of that work was in service of goals that we still have today about overturning some of the structures of society that leave many people behind. And so anyway, this book is very important to me because it takes the history and bridges it to the present by looking at how young people in this moment in time, in the late 1960s, took action to help their communities in kind of the same way that young people are doing today, and organizing around issues of white supremacy and systemic racism and police violence still. So my hope is that they will see what people have done in the past and use it to create their own movement.
Your story is very connected to the story of Alcatraz.
Yeah.
It's the same California. S.I. Hayakawa putting down the student riots. The decision on the part of the Indians of all tribes, they would engage in peaceful, and they would not resist because they knew they would be killed, quite frankly. And in fact, some of the people I knew who were part of this said, we're worried about the Black Panthers because they resisted, they were going to get killed.
Yeah.
And in fact, virtually everybody they knew who was a Panther was killed at that period, murdered or shot by police or some circumstance like Bobby.
Yeah.
So it's a very, very real parallel between the two, and it's the same kind of oppressive situation that they were really rebelling against.
So we would sit here and chat with one another all day, as you can see, and I have plenty of questions. But if you want to open it up, do you have any questions you'd like to ask the panel, or about any particular books? You're more than welcome to. Yes.
I was wondering about your series, The History Smasher. Did you get a lot of pushback?
It gets the usual pushback from people who don't like facts. So, I mean, there are, we have one, History Smashers, The American Revolution, that talks about the fact that most of our first presidents enslaved people, and there's a certain tiny percentage of the population that loses their mind over that and thinks it's just inappropriate to tell the truth about people from the past. I disagree, so I do my job, and they do their thing, and it's okay. It hasn't been, they're very popular in schools. and libraries and with homeschooling families, and it's not a lot of people. I mean, it's that tiny loud majority that's doing everything right now. But yeah, sure, there's pushback.
A tiny majority is the way to put it, too.
Well, a tiny minority is what I meant to say.
Majority,
Yeah,
their
it's just
voices are often too
tiny loud minority. Yeah. But yeah, it honestly it revs me up to do better research and find even more. It just revs me up. Any other questions? Yeah.
What's the next history mystery that you are really looking forward to having time to dive into?
The next book after Columbus is the Salem Witch Trials, which was really interesting. And after that, we're revising right now is Earth Day and the Environment. That's about the history of environmentalism. Linda?
I know you're all super curious people, right? So how do you decide when something's a curiosity and when something's a book? And I'm looking at you, Jason, in particular, because I know how long it takes you to do, like,
Yeah, it takes
some
a
of
long
us can do different things at different times, but
Yeah.
books each take a long time, you have to be committed, so how does that happen?
Yeah, it takes a long time. This book took 1.5 years. That's typical when I write and illustrate. And you're right, I have a lot of things I'm interested in. And a lot of things, actually a lot of topics I go pretty far, do a lot of research and realize that there isn't a book there. But the thing that makes it possible to do a book is when I find a story. So I'm writing about science, and there isn't necessarily a story in the scale of an atom, right? Like, it's just a fact that they're so this size. So a lot of my process is looking for that story that's going to carry a kid through a book, because I like books with stories. So that's what makes me want to turn the page. It's not finding the next fact necessarily. So it's when I find the topic that I'm passionate about and the good story to go along with it, a way to put that information into a book. That's what I know.
Can I ask Loree about that? Because this book, One Long Line, is actually the first in a series of books that explore topics in science and experiments in science, and I'd like to know how you did that for the next book in the series and what else you're thinking of.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, what you just said, Jason, resonates so much with me. It's finding a story for me. This book grew out of, here's the story, and you'll see why I couldn't turn it into a book. My kids found a caterpillar in the yard, and they wanted to keep it in a shoebox in their bedroom. And generally, I'm an enabler in those situations, I'm sure, but we need to figure out what kind of caterpillar this is so that we can feed it, so that it doesn't die in the shoebox in your room. And so, how are we going to find out what kind of caterpillar it is? Well, there's a couple ways. I would have taken a picture and looked online to find out what it was. But Ben and Sam Burns decided to follow the caterpillar until it started chewing on something. And that would give us a clue to what it ate. And that seemed reasonable, and so I let them go. Anyway, I was telling that story to a friend of mine. We never did figure it out because it took a long time for the caterpillar to find its food. Ben and Sam got bored, they moved on, the caterpillar got lost, end of story. But I was telling this story to a friend. We still don't have a book here, right? So I was telling this story to a friend who said, A, Loree, you are the cruelest mother I've ever met. And B, you should know about this guy named Jean-Henri Fabre who found these processionary caterpillars that looked an awful lot like the line of caterpillar, child, crawling across my backyard. But these are caterpillars who line up head to tail in lines 20, 30, 200 caterpillars long. And that's how they move. They never are found. They're social caterpillars, that's their only way of moving. And so he dropped off for me, this friend, some essays by this, I always get it wrong, so he died in the 18th century. He was an 18th century scientist who studied those processionary caterpillars. I read all about him. I spent a very long time reading everything he'd ever written, but I couldn't figure out how to tell the story. And it took me it took me 15 years to figure out how to get it right. And so, so for me, the answer is always looking for the story, but also recognizing that sometimes, you know, I don't have it. It takes a long time to find my way into it, and it's interesting. I'm curious about it, but what's the story that's going to pull some other person into it? And finding that's always the trick for me.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's a long-winded version of what Jason just told you.
So exciting to be here with you. I'm wondering about readers that you engage before the book is going to be published or before you create your final copy. Who are those people? What ages are they? How do you decide who you want to have as your kind of scrutinizing readers for what you're very excited about?
You want to start that?
Did
Go
you?
ahead. I don't share what I'm working on with other. Are you talking about like kind of focus grouping,
Yeah.
like testing it out? I don't do that.
Interesting.
I ask kids questions. I was working on a book about hurricanes, and I was talking to a lot of kids last weekend who have experienced hurricanes, what it was like. But I'm probably not going to share what I'm working on with them until it's done.
I was just going to say, most of my readers who read a manuscript in advance before the book is published are adults. So other writers or my editors. I have a writers group that, you know, reviews chapter by chapter kind of thing. I often will, though, when I'm writing history that's targeted to young readers, I will often talk to kids of the age of the book that I'm writing to try to understand what they know about that period of time. So, for example, I'm working on a new project, and without getting into explaining what that project is, one of the things I'm doing is sort of looking at different moments in history and explaining that history to an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old. And so, I have to describe Abraham Lincoln. And so I'm like, okay, I have to write a story about Abraham Lincoln. Similar to kind of what Kate is doing in terms of telling what is the truth. You know, we think, okay, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, there's a little more to it than that, right? And, you know, what Lincoln's feelings about, you know, slavery and black people were is a little more complicated than how we normally present it. And so I spoke to a young child and I said, okay, well, you know, tell me what you know about Abraham Lincoln already, because I'd like to know what we're starting with, right? And she said, he's something about 77, but I don't know what that means, and he had a tall hat.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay,
Work with
that's what we know? Okay, then I know that I need to start with, you know, this is a very typical big reader kid, right? So this is somebody who I expect is kind of on par with the average kid of her age. So from that, I was able to say, okay, I need to think about how to shape the story with that as a starting point. So I do things like that.
In the case of this book, most cases I will actually deal with people who were part of the story. When I wrote a book called, a novel called Code Talker, I worked with actual Navajo code talkers who read everything I had written before it was published and offered suggestions. In the case of this book, Kent Blancett, who's a friend of mine, wrote a book, and I'll read the title, A Journey to Freedom, Richard Oakes, Alcatraz, and the Red Power Movement. And it was for adults, focusing on Richard Oakes, one of the central characters in that. So naturally, Kent read everything I wrote. I also gave it to Adam Fortunate Eagle, who was a central part of the takeover, and had written 2 books about it. I gave the manuscript to Leneda Means Warjack, who was one of the central women in the takeover of Alcatraz, and she read it, and in every case, they commented and they corrected. Because quite frankly, there's been a lot written about this, and everything that's written about it, with almost no exception, has mistakes in it. Sometimes they're glaring errors, wrong people, wrong time, wrong place, wrong interpretation of what happened. For example, my friend Adam said that Richard Oakes jumped off this boat that was near Alcatraz, tried to swim to the island, couldn't make it, and then was rescued. Actually, he did make it all the way to the island. But that was a mistake that was made by someone who was actually there at the time. Well, imagine people who were second and third hand, who never experienced it personally, who made assumptions. So I always try, when I'm writing a nonfiction book, to go as close back to the original people involved as possible, rather than trust the secondary, tertiary, sources, which often have misinterpretations. I found that especially writing about Native American history in almost any aspect of it, there's always misinterpretation, usually done by non-Native people who are not present at the event.
Yeah, we probably have time for one last question.
When you don't have an opportunity to talk to someone who was physically present at a historical event, or just somebody with more knowledge, what are the best research tools that you found for digging deeper into something that's like mythologized, or just that there's a lot of misconceptions about it? How do you get to like the actual truth?
I think this is probably true for you, Kekla. Going back to the people who were part of it, what they wrote, what they recorded, as opposed to things written by later scholars, some of whom have no connection to it. That's one thing I always do. And then trust the indigenous voice, trust the voice of the people who were there. And writing about, for example, Crazy Horse. I worked with the descendants of Crazy Horse, who most people don't know. And they tell very different stories than the standard history is told. And I believe their stories, and they're well backed up in many ways. So that would be my response.
I would say also, I found a surprising amount of information more locally, even for stories that were national, right? So if there's something that got huge national attention, but it took place in this specific place, that town's historical society or historical council or library is going to have some often oral histories. There's a surprising amount of oral histories available just in libraries nationwide, and also the Library of Congress has a surprising amount of oral histories. Like there's a lot of civil rights oral histories that have been taken, and so it's like recorded voices or it's transcriptions and things like that. So I actually found some oral history transcriptions of like Black Panther Party members and things like that. But yeah, primary sources as much as possible, and the things that were written in the contemporary time, but you have to consider the source of the person that wrote it in the contemporary time. So mainstream media writing about what the Black Panthers were doing in the 1960s is different than reading the Black Panthers' own newspaper. But that is an example of a primary source that was really helpful, is their own newspaper, which also has its flaws because they have their own way of reporting things, right? So it's kind of a balancing act.
I've learned not to trust newspaper reporters, quite frankly. And I've had personal experience with that quite recently, but that's another story. I was on the Meredith March in Mississippi with Jimmy Meredith. And at one point during the Meredith March, a big black car pulled up and Marlon Brando got out. And he marched with us all the way into Jackson, where Stokely Carmichael gave the first Black Power speech. So I read the newspaper account the next day, and it says, Marlon Brando turned up for a cameo appearance and then got back in his car and drove back to his hotel, which wasn't true. He was sitting there right in the front, and members of Stokely's group were saying, Mr. Brando, could I have your autograph? Black Power. But history is often like that.
Yeah.
And the people who write about it often are the people who misinterpret it.
And have their own agendas of what they're trying to portray, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, there are many, many hundreds of articles written in local newspapers about Black Panther Party offices raided and they all got arrested, but actually they hadn't done anything wrong, so they got released the next day. But you don't see that article, right? So it's a perspective that's being perpetuated no matter what, depending on who the source is.
Yep. I would listen to this group all day. Thank you so much for all the insight, and thank you for coming to the panel. All of our books are out in the main reading room with Phoenix Books, and we'll be out there signing after the panel, and we really appreciate you coming this afternoon.